Hey guys, this is Tyler here, and I'm going to discuss here my opinion and outlook on this whole situation with Mr Laundrie and this Gabby Petito. Okay, so many people may know here, this was a very well publicized situation that took place in the state of Utah, Florida, New York. It actually is all over the U.S. This case. Primarily, though, a lot of it is focused in both, like the West, like Utah, and then also in Florida. So this was basically a couple. I'll just run through here very briefly. Most people probably already know this. This couple, basically, they were 22 and 23 years old. Brian was 23, Gabby was 22, and they had met in high school, and then eventually they had started dating, and they had been in a relationship for about 2 years until this Gabby disappeared. And they suspect she disappeared somewhere around late August when she was camping with this boyfriend at the time, Brian, and then eventually she went missing. He had already arrived back to his home or his parents' home in Florida where he lived, and it took some time for Gabby's family to realize that she was missing. Obviously, anyone who's missing is a tragedy, but I think there's a lot of lessons and things we can learn here. This is a great application of why we are MGTOW people, why this philosophy of MGTOW has grown so much. Firstly, one of the things I find quite interesting, and this is common in many of these types of cases, disappearance, these kind of victimhood narratives, where the guy is always accused of being the perpetrator, the female is always the victim. We see the same situation again and again. Unfortunately here, this is what sells, firstly, in mainstream media. I mean, if people weren't appealed to this obviously wouldn't be pushed. It's just baffles me how many places I see, like on different videos, and YouTubers have different videos, and sometimes they have live chats, and it is so one-sided. There's never any reflection. Perhaps Brian wasn't the guy who did this, who was actually the perpetrator of this homicide. Maybe it was someone else, but that's never introduced because that doesn't quite fit the narrative. Obviously, news is a business. They have to sell a narrative, a story, and this is very much first and foremost. In terms of the whole situation, though, people never look deeper into relationships and the causes of why there's so many problems nowadays, just as there has been for some time. They're always looking at the effect. They're not looking at what comes before that. And the fact that the parental involvement in kids' relationships and marriages, as was the case many years ago, in America and much of the world, is now almost non-existent apart from certain groups like Amish or perhaps some of the Mormons. Other than that, though, many groups, even Americanized Muslims or Americanized Buddhists, most of these groups do not follow any kind of system. And so their kids go into these relationships without their input, without anything meaningful, and especially on behalf of the girl or woman, they really need the guidance and assistance of the parents here. They especially the father. There has to be much more attention given here, but it's not. Obviously, that's the society that we live in. They, of course, want to push fathers outside of the picture as much as possible. In fact, here also I find it noteworthy that Petito's parents were divorced, or mom was remarried to someone else, and I don't know about her dad, but she obviously grew up in a two-parent household starting from a young age, which no question led to other problems. I also look at the eyes. Stefan Molyneux has pointed this out. You got to look at the eyes in the whole facial expressions when you watch someone. I've watched videos of her, and she did not look like the most sane person. I've seen videos from when she was still alive, and just looks like someone that is unstable. There's something there. Maybe has depression, has other anxiety, whatever it may be. She certainly did not look like a healthy person to me internally. Physically, she looked fine, but internally, she looked very, something was going on there. Whereas, like with Brian, for example, I know there's been body language experts who've covered his body language and his expressions, but really, I did not see that as much with him. I just, maybe a little, but he honestly looked a lot more stable. And I also find it interesting, this kind of segues into a very famous police cam video that was published just a few weeks ago that displayed an instance back in August where Petito had engaged in some kind of physical altercation with Brian. She caused it, she started it, and he had scratches, he had marks on his face, on his body, and ironically, she didn't get charged that day when they were pulled over by this cop. And if this was him in that situation, there's no question he would have been spending the night in jail, in my opinion. And that's just one example of where things could have been prevented, things could have changed. Maybe if she had spent some days in jail, she would have had a kind of a change of heart, or Brian would have, and stuff would have been peacefully resolved, or they would have gone their own ways and both made it back to their home state. But that obviously didn't happen. In this sense, the police dropped the ball, and it just illustrates how one-sided our court system our court system is in America. And the whole judicial system is so against men in favor of women. Any kind of domestic altercations like this, if it's a guy against a woman, the guy's always arrested. They're always going to be charged for something, even if it's just a misdemeanor. This is obviously not the case often with females. And I personally know family members, extended family members, that have gone through cases of domestic abuse from their spouse, where it's been the guy who's been abused by their wife or ex-wife, and they, like in Brian's case, they don't want to press charges. They try to keep hush about it. They don't contact police or anything. They try to peacefully resolve it without having to take it to the next level. And obviously, this is the one-sided nature now of the society we live in. Going back, though, to a previous point I also made is the fact that technically there's nothing 100% that shows without reasonable doubt that Brian is guilty of this crime. There's not sufficient evidence here. Technically, they could present circumstantial evidence, but it's still not there. What's interesting also, though, is with Brian. He obviously was like 22 years old. This guy, from what it appeared like, was also unemployed. He didn't have a lot of financial means either. I have said this, and this is something that many guys in the manosphere, POAs, disagree with me about, MRAs. I could mention individual YouTubers, big guys that most guys here would know, and I think some of these guys have great things to say. Some things I don't agree with, but we can see here that Gen Z gals aren't always looking for guys with money, with status, with looks, any of this stuff. This is a prime example. Look at, I'm not saying that Petito was out of Brian's league. I'm just illustrating this here. And also just the fact, was Brian an alpha kind of guy? I don't think so. I mean, just by how it appeared and stuff. I mean, nothing really shows this, but we see all too often guys in the manosphere like saying how, if you have this, you'll be, you'll have a girlfriend, you'll have fine-looking gals. Obviously, Brian didn't bring any of this stuff to the table. And I've been saying this. This had started with the latter half of millennials. A lot of these gals now do not look at those areas. They don't follow. And it goes back to what I mentioned prior. Also due to the lack of parental discretion here in relationships. Remember also now, too, that we're getting into a new decade, a new era. We can look at the heavy diversion of the U.S. and other Western countries from a very market-facing, very capitalist society. Each year goes by, become more and more socialist, and I don't see this very entrepreneur go-getter mindset that I think was, or fake it till you make it mindset that was pushed a lot in the decade prior. This, I think, is kind of going away. We're seeing more focus now on other more trivial areas, and I think that's also prime example here, the fact that Brian didn't have much to his name, and he still had a girlfriend. He was going to become married, and he certainly didn't look like a gym rat. He physically was in good shape. He I'm sure had good health, but he wasn't by any means any like bodybuilder. He was also going bald. For a guy in his early 20s, quite different going bald at that age compared to late 20s, like me, obviously. No, I'm joking here. The thing is that you have to consider that we hear a lot about this whole looks maxing and all that jazz, but I always tell people, and I think it's great working out, exercising and whatnot, that you go to the gym a lot if you want to attract other men, other guys. Anyone who's had some gay friends or gay acquaintances knows this. Generally speaking, in the gym, it's gay men that tend to value those areas more than women, actually. Maybe in the 1990s or early 2000s it was different, but usually that's more the case. If you're a gay dude and you want a guy, gym's probably actually the best place to be. But just remember here that what Brian did from the beginning of the case, by the fact that he has not spoken, I have to commend him here. Very smart, because no matter how this case is put together, it is going to be against him. Unfortunately, that's how, I mean, due to public sentiment, and that's why I mentioned this. Public sentiment is so big now, with just as it has been. People say, oh, they always mention judicial criminal system. Who is, or what is the system? It's reflective of the public sentiment of the people and what they desire from these cases. They want certain narratives presented, certain outcomes. We saw this with this George Floyd and Chauvin case. Other O.J. Simpson from many years ago was another example. It often goes lockstep with that public sentiment. That's why they spend so much money and resources going through this huge swampland in Florida trying to allegedly find Brian, which on a side note, I don't think he's in there, and I don't think he's been there. And maybe I'm wrong on this, but I think he is long gone. Maybe he's in a different part of the country. He may also have left the country also. A good lesson here, though, and this is really important, I think, nowadays, just as guys have been telling people to have some kind of maybe webcam, have some verbal dialogue on a phone that illustrates that, like, relationship, you're having cordial relations, like in the bedroom and whatnot. I think the same is true. If a guy is on a trip like this, and I have a family member, extended family member, who went on a trip and actually had a breakup during the trip, and I don't know if they went their separate ways while they were out of the state. I think they did. Maybe you should have some kind of message or something that's, stating that everything is fine and you guys are parting ways. Unfortunately, like, if there was some kind of message that Brian had sent, and then if there was some kind of response or something, maybe that could have been enough for them to see that he wasn't the guy here. Maybe not, though. I'm starting to wonder, though, also whether it was someone that tied directly to them or some other person that actually caused the homicide with Petito. I just, it's hard to say here. There's a lot of MGTOW lessons here. We can look at, like, the age gap here, very small age gap. Often a big problem, obviously, with relationships. Not always, but especially here. This was prime example. Another example, I think, and I've mentioned this in other videos, we can see kind of, I think this Gen Z lack of ability to communicate effectively, to reason through problems, is more prevalent than ever than generation, even compared to millennials. I've mentioned this, many guys in my age group or guys that are younger that have been with Gen Zers, often it's the same kind of breakup. It's a ghosting. It's often not even necessarily a call or a text. Sometimes the gal just doesn't even respond, and they certainly don't bring up issues prior of things that are they don't like. Often it's just ghosting, and that's interesting because that may have been what happened here. There may have been kind of the same effect, and ironically, the investigators and the FBI don't like to look at how does Gen Z really communicate with each other. They have often terrible ability, especially the girls and women of this generation, to resolve conflict, to bring up problems before, or even to discuss them. It's often this whole ghosting effect. And we see where this goes now. And Brian's in a very precarious situation. I would be very surprised if he is ever caught, if he doesn't end up having to go to prison for a long time. This is probably going to be some kind of kangaroo court here, because it's going to be to satisfy the public appetite for long sentences in America, unless he has a good story or they find someone else that can be traced to this. But that doesn't always work, even when there's proof of evidence. I mean, we saw this case with Chauvin and Floyd, and there was body cam. There was, so many witnesses, and that didn't mean anything in the courts. We're in a different era now. It's interesting too, because if Brian was the one that was, if they had changed roles, like Gabby had killed Brian, you think this would have gotten your amount of publicity, as much outcry? It's unbelievable what the circus now we see now in America. And also, there's this concept of white woman or white girl missing syndrome, I believe it's called. We can see often anytime a white woman or girl is kidnapped or they're involved in this kind of altercation, it gets huge publicity. And some people think it's just simply news outlets putting more focus. I think there is a huge part of that, though, is the people. Ultimately the people entertain these videos, these channels, so they come to them and watch them. So obviously, for some reason, this group is, I guess, this probably is the most protected group in America at this point. And that's interesting, because there's a lot of cases, young black men go missing all the time, Latino men all the time, and they don't get nearly the amount of attention. Sometimes they get no attention. Very interesting kind of how both the narrative is run and also what people gravitate towards. So to conclude here, for anyone who's dating, look at this situation and use it as a reference. And we MGTOW guys know why we live the way we do. We value our freedom. We value not being incarcerated, not going through kangaroo courts. And this is a fine case to illustrate this. I say live on and be a proud MGTOW person.